Hello guys, and welcome to episode 7 of our Dissemination Day series. This is the third episode in the Practice Leadership series, and today we're going to be looking at this paper here, which is Observing Practice Leadership in Intellectual and Developmental Disability Services by Julie Beadle-Brown, C. Bigby, and E. Bold. Alright, this came from the Journal of Intellectual Disability Research, which is published on behalf of MenCap and in association with IACID. It was published in December 2015, and I'll put the reference in the slide for you. So the background for this piece of research, initially it talks about the Mansell report, and it talks about one of the things that was identified in the Mansell report, which was that generally speaking, most structural, organisational and management factors are only weakly associated with service user outcomes. So the question that it's asking is, what are the important management factors? How do we, which of those management factors are most important in ensuring good outcomes for the supported individuals? Specifically, they mention a guy called Cotter and references 2007 paper where he says that most of the executives I have known in successful cases of major change learn to walk the talk. They consciously attempt to become a living symbol of the new corporate culture. So they focus a lot in their background on the impact of culture and how that then goes on to ensure good practice leadership and good outcomes for the supported individuals and services. Specifically, they identify or they talk about a direct frontline manager as being the most important person in ensuring good practice leadership and good outcomes at the service level. They don't necessarily say what a direct frontline manager exactly is. Like, is it a team leader? Is it a senior support worker? Is it a deputy manager or the overall service manager? But they talk very clearly about how for direct support professionals, it's the frontline manager who defines the job, provides the training, mediates the stress, creates the culture, helps people find personally satisfying rewards, and establishes a well-functioning work environment. And that came from a US study, Hewitt et al. Following that initial background, when they set the kind of scene, they go on to define practice leadership as usually a frontline manager, so not necessarily, who develops, encourages and supports their staff team to put into practice the vision of the organisation. So that's coming back to that sense again of being the living symbol of a corporate culture. I think this is quite interesting because it's something we notice a lot when we go out to services or different organisations that they work with. Quite often they've got these slogans or their vision plastered across all of their marketing materials or even on the service signs, and it'll be, important stuff. It'll say things like dignity, respect, autonomy, all of these kinds of really powerful words, and you see them all over the place, but you don't necessarily see them being lived in the services. And I noticed this particularly in the Walton Hall episode when the manager is sitting talking and you can see all those words on the background of the wall when they're being filmed, and it's all these big words, all these important words, but actually having them on the wall doesn't mean anything. How do you take those values and ensure they're being delivered, with integrity within your services? The rationale for this study they have cited as being, despite the fact that we're all kind of in agreement that frontline managers are super important and we understand that, there hasn't actually been a great deal of research on empirically evidencing the basis for practice leadership in these sorts of situations. In a previous study in 2014, Julie Beadle-Brown references that staff report that they receive only low levels of practice leadership generally. Bearing that in mind, the researchers here decided to use an objective measure to track perceptions of practice leadership and services over time. So what they've discussed is that, generally speaking, practice leadership is measured according to self-report or qualitative measures, and they have developed an objective measure for practice leadership, which they are using here, and it seems to be a 12-item, what they call a practice leadership index. They test it across a sample of 58 services across 9 organisations. That's quite substantial. And they aimed to establish the reliability and internal consistency and describe the extent of practice leadership and the relationships between practice leadership and the quality of staff support using that measure. Specifically, they identified 3 research questions. The first of this was, what are the psychometric properties of the observed measure of practice leadership? The second is there a relationship between scores on the practice leadership measure and measures of quality and frequency of staff support and outcomes for the supported individuals? And thirdly, does strong practice leadership discriminate between services in terms of the quality of staff support? So I think that'll be the really interesting one for me. So they actually did go on to define the term frontline manager. So in contradiction to what I said previously, they did that in the aims of the study section. The term frontline manager is used to refer to the individual who has direct line responsibility for leading the practice of staff on a day-to-day basis. This role may be combined with other responsibilities across one or more services. So again, that's quite a broad definition. So they took a baseline in the form of an audit for each of the supported individuals, and in that audit they collected demographic information. They used the short adaptive behaviour scale, the aberrant behaviour checklist, they sought consent, and other information around whether or not there were physical impairments or how verbal the person was with communication. And the main measure of the quality of staff support was the active support measure, Mansell and Elliott revised. They then used momentary time sampling to assess the degree to which the service users were engaged in meaningful activity. And how they did was they had 2-hour segments, and within this 2-hour segment they used a 1-minute time interval. So the way that works is they would be observing for 2 hours, and on the minute, every minute, they would score whether or not the person was engaged in various different kinds of activity in that second. So not for the whole of the minute prior necessarily, but in the moment that they looked up, momentary time sampling. There were a number of different codes for the momentary time sampling, and it included whether or not the person was engaged in social or not social activities, whether they were engaged in problem behaviour or self-stimulatory behaviour, or whether they were receiving assistance or other contact from staff, contact from other service users, etc. So that was quite wide, but specifically what they were looking at was the percentage of time that service users were receiving assistance from staff to be engaged in meaningful activity, or the percentage of time they were engaged in meaningful activity at all, including social interaction. The practice leadership measure that they had developed had been kind of refined over a number of uses, and they taught individuals how to use this sort of newly polished method that they had. They reported that their inter-rater reliability was high, which means that they check how good you are at using it and if everybody's in agreement. So there's good reason to believe that that was working well. But they were specifically looking at 3 different things. So first of all, they did an unstructured observation of the frontline manager during a visit to the service. So we're just watching to see how you operate, essentially. Secondly, they conducted a semi-structured interview with the frontline manager, and where possible with some of the staff that they are responsible for. So they're seeking more particular kinds of information, but still allowing for some qualitative contributions. And thirdly, they reviewed paperwork that they would deem to be relevant for practice leadership, including staff supervisions or team meeting minutes, etc. So I've actually just been to have a look, and they have attached in an appendix to the article a copy of the observational practice leadership measure and examples of how to code it across each domain. And it's actually really quite detailed and gives really kind of clear advice about how you're supposed to code each of the sections, which I think will have made it much, much easier for people to use. So that's really good. The last thing that they did here that I thought was good research was they had different researchers do the different elements. So whoever did the active support measure was different to whoever did the interview, to whoever did, and so on, so that you had kind of independence between the observers. So they analysed their results in this study with statistical testing, and to be honest, it's quite complex to understand. You know, there's lots of tables and various bits and pieces, but rather than report that all directly, I think it's more helpful to pull out in kind of basic terms some of what they understood. And the key message reading the results is that good active support was very much linked to higher levels of practice leadership. But sadly, practice leadership really didn't score particularly well across any of the 58 services other than one or two of them. In fact, I think they even had to change the bar that they had set for practice leadership because only 5 services of the 58 services met the initial bar that they had set on average. So they adopted a less stringent rating of practice leadership to be able to conduct their tests. So with regards to results, in clear terms, they were happy with the reliability of the observed measure of practice leadership. They were pleased with how that worked out. The measure was found to have good internal consistency, so people were using it similarly. Good inter-rater reliability, so 2 people looking at the same thing were finding generally the same thing. And it appears that it discriminated well between services and quality practices, etc. So, additionally, as had been the hypothesis in the first place, when practice leadership is better, active support appears to be better implemented and service users are more engaged. So pretty much in summary of the results, of the 58 services, they found that only 5 of those services rated as having good to excellent practice leadership overall, which is really low. That's like, less 8%, something like that. Additionally, of all of the services, only a third of them, were reported as receiving good, consistent active support, and 1/3 of supported individuals were reported as receiving weak active support. So only 33%-ish of them were receiving good, and another 33%-ish of them weren't just receiving okay-ish, they were receiving rubbish active support. The figure that they reported for engagement was less than 50% of the time. So people with supported people were on average spending less than 50% of their time engaged in meaningful activity. And actually, I wish it did surprise me, but that doesn't. And I was listening to a podcast, I think it was Inside Track, maybe, and somebody was on talking about training for building independent living skills, and she reported that 60% of the time spent by people with learning disabilities is unstructured or unengaged. So that seems to be a pretty consistent figure, which is just massive. I'm not sure that statement's particularly going to blow anyone away, because I'm sure if we had said at the start, do we think practice leadership will have an impact on service user engagement and active support, then we'd be going, yeah, of course it does. But what's nice about this is that they've actually kind of empirically demonstrated that. So when you're pushing for better practice leadership in services, there is evidence as to why you need to be doing that, rather than just because we're all in agreement that practice leadership must be good. One issue they had, which I think was really interesting, was they said they struggled sometimes to identify the position or the person within a service who is going to be responsible for delivering practice leadership, or who is deemed to be responsible for delivering practice leadership or for leading on practice leadership. And I think that is so true for so many of the services. Nobody's quite sure whose job it should be to take responsibility for that. They also highlighted that the biggest difficulty that they had was the level of chaos in services. So trying to get physically organised to come in and do an interview, trying to get physically organised to come in and do an observation was one of the biggest barriers that they had. And that is, again, that most definitely rings true for us. How many times have we been working with services who are really struggling to manage that kind of thing? And that obviously has an impact on our ability to collect the evidence for this research. Interestingly, they found that active support ratings were better when the practice leadership was responsible for organising the staff team better, when team meetings were held and focused on quality of life, which I think is really important. We shout about our practice workshops and needing to focus on quality of life, and that actually has a discernible effect is really good evidence. There was an interesting relationship between active support and staff contact and engagement and service usability. So they found that the more adaptive functioning skills a service user had, the better active support they tended to receive. In other words, people with more severe requirements were receiving less. And I think that's quite worrying, and I'd be interested to examine why that was the case. Do staff not feel equipped to really support more severely impaired individuals? Are they kind of like hesitating to do that because they don't feel like they are confident in their abilities in that domain, or is it just that people who are more severely impaired might have less clear communication abilities, so maybe they're not able to shout as much about wanting support or wanting help. So in terms of the takeaway message, which is obviously the most important part of this, what can we take away from it? I think there are a few things. Firstly, it is not uncommon for services to be not fantastic at practice leadership. And it, like they said, only 8-ish% of the services they assessed were doing it really, really well. So there is always going to be room for improvement. And if you're working in a service where you feel like it's not fantastic already, don't feel alone. There's clearly a lot of work to be done in this area. Love that they have developed an observable measure for practice leadership, and I would love to have a go at using it. It looks pretty friendly to me, and I'll show you a wee screenshot of it, but I won't obviously give you the whole thing because it doesn't belong to me. Additionally, I think I'm very interested in the fact that the active support measure is so good active support is so linked to good practice leadership. And again, it's not rocket science, but I love to have a reference to talk about when we're discussing that. And I'm really interested in, how can we use that information to address this 60% of unstructured time? How can we use this information to increase staff engagement? Do we need to specifically look at, are they less confident engaging with individuals who have more profound requirements? Really good practice leaders can transform a service, and clearly, as they have recognised in this paper, that requires for them to live and breathe the culture. It can't just be something that we paint on the wall. It can't just be something that we put on the sign at the entrance to the service. Practice leadership is actually quite complicated. It's difficult to measure. Services are busy and chaotic, and that is a natural confounding factor for trying to implement practice leadership in the first place. But when you do, the outcomes are super worth it. I think that's what I'm taking from this paper. Anyway, so I hope you found that interesting. I found it interesting. I'd love to hear more about it, if so. I'll watch for future research coming from that episode. So we have one more episode left on practice leadership, and that will hopefully be Paddy in 2 weeks' time. And then we're going to move on to our third topic, our third series. So we're kind of doing 4 in each at the moment. And I am going to move us on to treatments for self-injurious behaviour. So we've done, obviously, restraint reduction. We're doing practice leadership. And now I think it would be a good time for us to focus on something really specific rather than the general that we have been doing. So yeah, treatments for self-injurious behaviour starting in episode 9. All right, thanks for listening.